Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The sky over Valtiz 9 burned with the glow of industry, a sullen red haze cast by towering refineries and endless shipyards. The once pristine atmosphere, poisoned by centuries of unrelenting production, shimmered under the artificial suns that orbited above, their light cold and sterile. From orbit, the planet resembled a sprawling forge, its skeletal scaffolds and colossal construction bays stretching like metallic veins over its tortured surface. This was the beating heart of the Galactic Council's war machine, a place where rebellion should have been impossible. Yet, rebellion had come. Kieran lay prone atop a silent cargo crane, his body motionless despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. He adjusted the optic scope on his visor, scanning the industrial labyrinth below. Colossal ship frames, partially constructed battlecruisers, stood like steel monoliths, their unfinished hulls gleaming beneath the harsh floodlights. Automated arms moved with mechanical precision, welding, plating, assembling. Each of these warships, when complete, would be capable of subjugating entire planets. Dozens were under construction. If this mission failed, the free worlds would not survive the cycle. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. No second chances. No retreat. A soft crackle in his earpiece broke the silence. Phase 1 in position, came Talia's voice, barely more than a whisper. She was stationed at the coolant relay, where the core temperature regulators for the reactors were housed. Ready when you are. Phase 2 standing by, added Varen from deep inside the refinery complex. Kieran's fingers hovered over the command pad strapped to his wrist. The plan was brutally simple. Disable the orbital defense grid, overload the fusion cores, and let the planet's own infrastructure consume itself. This was not a battle. This was an execution. His grip tightened. Stand by for my mark. Below, a squad of sentries patrolled the upper catwalks. Their once pristine white armor was dulled by years of wear, their movements casual. They did not expect an attack. Why would they? The Council had ruled for centuries, its fleets unmatched, its enemies crushed before they could rise. No fleet had ever dared challenge them. No rebellion had ever survived long enough to strike at the core of their power. Their complacency was their weakness. Kieran tapped the control pad. Across the shipyard, the lights flickered, just a brief disturbance in the power grid, subtle enough to be dismissed as routine maintenance. A moment later, he felt it, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the metal beneath him. The reactor overload had begun. Phase 1, initiate. Talia did not reply, but a second later, a plume of pressurized steam erupted from the cooling towers. The effect was immediate. Pressure valves hissed, releasing excess heat into the atmosphere. Within minutes, the core temperature would rise beyond safe thresholds. Alarms would trigger, but the safety systems had already been rewritten. There would be no emergency shutdown. Kieran watched the first signs of confusion spread through the facility. Engineers paused, glancing at their consoles. A red warning beacon pulsed in the distance. Someone shouted. The shipyard was waking up. Too late. Phase 2, go. The refinery exploded. A geyser of molten metal shot into the sky, debris raining down in fiery streaks. The sentries on the catwalk spun in confusion. One of them reached for his comm unit. Kieran pulled the trigger. The muffled hiss of his rifle cut through the chaos. The sentry jerked and crumpled, his body toppling over the railing. The others hesitated. Seconds lost to uncertainty. Seconds they did not have. Below, the panic spread. Engineers abandoned their posts. Emergency sirens screamed through the shipyard. Security teams scrambled, weapons drawn, their heads swiveling in search of an enemy they could not see. Automated defense turrets whirred to life, scanning for hostiles. But the attack was already inside the system. The orbital defense grid flickered. Once. Then darkened. A sharp beep on Kieran's wrist console confirmed the final sequence. He pressed the command without hesitation. Deep within the planet's crust, the reactor shielding disengaged. Extraction point, he ordered, already moving. The horizon blazed as the first shipyard collapsed, its structural supports crumbling in a cascade of molten steel and shrapnel. A chain reaction ignited, Fuel reserves detonated, sending shockwaves rippling across the industrial sector. The sky turned into a firestorm, burning brighter than the artificial suns above. A world built for war was tearing itself apart. And for the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council, the most feared empire in the known universe, stood defenseless. Even as Kieran sprinted toward his escape route, he knew the mission was far from over. The shipyards were gone, but what of the Council's fleets? They still held power, even if they could no longer replenish their numbers. Would they fall into chaos, or would they retaliate with everything they had left? And what of the rebellion itself? The plan had worked, but what came next? Could the scattered free worlds unite in time to finish what they had started? Most importantly, was the war truly won, or had it only just begun? The sky over Valtiz 9 was no longer red with industry. It was black with smoke, punctuated by the flickering glow of destruction. The shipyards, the Galactic Council's crown jewel, were gone, consumed by fire and collapse. The once thrumming heart of their military might had been reduced to a graveyard of twisted steel and molten wreckage. Kieran stood in the open doorway of the dropship, watching as the planet shrank beneath them. He could still see the shockwaves rippling through the atmosphere, the distant eruptions of reactors going critical one after another. The mission had succeeded. The Council's production line was obliterated. But instead of relief, an unsettling hollowness settled in his chest. Talia sat across from him, helmet off, sweat-matted hair clinging to her forehead. Her breathing was steady but tense, her fingers unconsciously drumming against the metal bench. She wasn't celebrating. None of them were. Varen broke the silence first. It was too easy. Kieran met his gaze. Easy. Varen's mouth tightened. Not easy, but clean. Too clean. A facility like that should have had redundancies, emergency defenses, fail-safes. Yet everything went down exactly as planned. No last-minute reinforcements, no countermeasures, no fail-safe override teams. Just silence. Kieran had felt it too. He had expected resistance, chaos, a desperate attempt by the Council to salvage their strongest stronghold. But their escape had been almost effortless. The facility had fallen like a structure already weakened from the inside. Talia exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Maybe they got complacent. Varen frowned. Or maybe they let it happen. The word sent a chill through the cabin. Let it happen. The idea was absurd. The Council wouldn't allow its primary shipyard to be destroyed unless it was no longer the primary shipyard. Kieran's mind raced. What if Valtiz 9 had already been made obsolete? What if the Council had moved its true production centers elsewhere, allowing them to think they had struck a decisive blow while the real war machine remained untouched? The dropship's pilot interrupted their thoughts. Approaching rendezvous coordinates. We'll be docking with the Ghost in 2 minutes. Kieran rose, rolling the tension from his shoulders. We need answers. Fast. As the dropship broke through the void and approached the Ghost, their flagship, the reality of their mission settled over them. The Council was wounded, but not dead. They had crippled the beast's limb, but its heart still beat. And if Varen was right, if the shipyards they had destroyed were nothing more than a relic of a past era, then the war was far from over. Docking clamps locked into place with a shudder. The ramp lowered, and they stepped onto familiar ground. The dimly lit corridors of the Ghost wrapped around them like an old coat, worn but reliable. The ship had been their home for years, an aging but formidable war vessel repurposed by the rebellion. A voice greeted them before they reached the bridge. Welcome back. I assume things went well. The speaker leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Commander Joran. Older than Kieran, battle-scarred but sharp, the kind of leader who thrived in war's uncertainty. We took down the shipyards, Kieran said. But something feels off. Joran's smirk faded. He pushed off the wall and motioned for them to follow. Then you'll want to see this. The bridge was quiet, save for the hum of instruments and the occasional beep of incoming transmissions. A holographic display flickered in the center of the room, casting an eerie blue glow. We intercepted this transmission 30 minutes ago, Joran said, tapping a control panel. Came from a deep space relay before the shipyards fell. The projection sharpened. A cold, mechanical voice filled the room. Directive executed. Valtiz 9 decommissioned. Mobilization proceeding as planned. Awaiting final authorization. A silence stretched between them. Talia's voice was barely above a whisper. Decommissioned. Varen cursed. They weren't relying on those shipyards anymore. Kieran's pulse quickened. If Valtiz 9 was already discarded, then where was the real threat? Joran turned to them, eyes hard. We didn't stop their fleet from growing. We just erased an old factory they no longer needed. Kieran stared at the transmission, his mind piecing together the implications. If the Council had anticipated the attack, if they had already moved their war production elsewhere, then everything they had just done was meaningless. Worse, it meant the Council was steps ahead of them. His fists clenched. No. Not meaningless. They had drawn blood. But now, they needed to find the true heart of the Council's war machine. And they had to do it fast. The bridge of the Ghost was heavy with silence, save for the low hum of the ship's core and the quiet beeping of the scanning array. Kieran stood motionless, eyes locked on the holographic projection floating in midair. Before them, a field of wreckage stretched into infinity. Charred hulls, shattered bulkheads, and the remains of what had once been a fleet formidable enough to challenge the stars. The insignia of the Galactic Council gleamed dully on torn plating, half melted and scarred from whatever had torn through them. The Council hadn't moved its fleet here. It had died here. Talia stood beside him, arms crossed, her breath slow and measured. This doesn't make sense. Varen, still at his station, exhaled sharply. Does anything lately? He tapped a few keys, pulling up deeper scans of the wreckage. Most of these ships were destroyed fast. No distress calls. No sign of retreat. They were wiped out before they could even send a warning. Kieran dragged a hand down his face, trying to shake the growing unease clawing at the back of his mind. By who? No one answered. The Council's fleets were unmatched. They didn't lose battles. They erased enemies. If something had annihilated them so thoroughly, so quickly, that not even a single ship had escaped, then whatever had done it was beyond anything they had faced before. Joran leaned forward, his usual smirk absent. Did we get anything from the wreckage? A distress beacon, a black box transmission, anything? The comms officer hesitated, fingers tightening on the console. We intercepted a fragmented transmission when we arrived. She swallowed. It's corrupted. But I'll play what we salvaged. The bridge's speakers crackled. A wall of static filled the air, interspersed with garbled words, broken phrases that sent a chill down Kieran's spine. No escape. It sees us. Shields useless, a shadow in the... The audio cut into a piercing shriek before abruptly falling silent. Talia let out a slow breath. Well, that's not unsettling at all. Joran's jaw tightened. A shadow in the what? The comms officer shook her head. That's all we got. The rest is just static. Varen shifted in his seat, expression dark. I don't like this. Neither did Kieran. Then the proximity alarms wailed. The crew jolted as the ship lurched, the Ghost sensors shrieking warnings across the bridge. Something had moved within the wreckage. Report. Kieran snapped. The helmsman's hands flew over the controls. We have a contact. No, multiple contacts, coming out of the debris field. Kieran turned to the main display. The wreckage, once still and silent, was shifting. At first, he thought it was the aftermath of an explosion, fragments caught in a gravitational pull. But then the movement sharpened. Smooth. Deliberate. Ships. At least, they looked like ships. Dark, angular forms drifted between the ruins, their surfaces reflecting the surrounding wreckage like liquid metal. No markings, no visible weapons, no heat signatures. They moved with an eerie silence, untouched by inertia, as if they weren't obeying the same laws of physics as everything else in space. Talia whispered, "Those aren't Council ships." Varen's voice was tight. "They aren't any ships." Then, one of them disappeared. No light distortion, no propulsion flare. One moment it was there. The next it was gone. Kieran felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. "Get me a full sensor scan. Now." The helmsman's fingers flew across the console. No energy signatures. No ion trails. It's like they were never there. Another ship flickered out of existence. Joran straightened, face grim. Tell me someone is getting this on record. The sensor officer shook her head. No readings. Nothing. It's like they're slipping between. She froze. Contact reappearing. Port side. One of the ships returned, closer than before. Kieran's gut twisted. It was watching them. He didn't have time to think before the ship moved. A tendril of dark energy lashed out from its hull, arcing through the void with terrifying precision. It struck a piece of Council wreckage, and the metal imploded, crushed inward like a can under immense pressure before disintegrating into dust. Talia took a step back from the display. What the hell was that? Kieran didn't have an answer. Then the ship turned toward the Ghost. Evasive maneuvers. Now! The helmsman slammed the controls, the Ghost veering hard as another tendril of dark energy lanced toward them. It missed by a fraction, the residual force rattling the hull like a shockwave. Joran grabbed the comm unit. All hands. Battle stations. Now! The bridge flared red as alarm sirens blared. The crew scrambled, weapon systems powering up, shields reinforcing. But Kieran felt the futility of it settle in his chest. Whatever these things were, they weren't bound by the rules of war the Council played by. They were something else. Talia's voice cut through the chaos. They aren't firing conventional weapons. They're consuming. Varen's fingers blurred over the weapons console. Doesn't matter. We hit them first. He fired. The plasma round streaked through the void, then vanished. Not deflected. Not absorbed. Gone. Talia's breath hitched. That's impossible. The ship shifted, almost as if it had turned to look at them. Then it flickered again, vanishing completely. Kieran swallowed. Helm, full burn out of here. Now. The engines roared, the Ghost rocketing away from the wreckage. The crew braced as the acceleration pressed them into their seats, the ship's frame groaning under the strain. Kieran kept his eyes locked on the sensors. If these things could vanish and reappear at will, distance wouldn't mean anything. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Nothing. The wreckage faded behind them. The unidentified ships did not pursue. Joran exhaled. What the hell was that? Kieran didn't answer. He didn't know. But he did know one thing. The Council hadn't abandoned Valtiz 9 because they were ahead of the rebellion. They had abandoned it because something had already beaten them. And whatever that something was, it was still out there, waiting. The ship moved like a hunted animal, silent, desperate, and trying not to be seen. The Ghost had run before, but never like this. Not from something it didn't understand. Not from something that shouldn't exist. Kieran sat in the dim glow of the command deck, fingers tightening around the edge of the console. His mind replayed the last moments in the Varro's Belt, the wrecked fleet, the impossible ship, the way it watched them before vanishing into the void. His instincts screamed at him, warning of something far worse than the Council. Talia broke the silence first. They let us leave. Joran, standing with his arms crossed near the viewport, turned his head slightly. You think they could have stopped us? She nodded, expression unreadable. If they wanted to. Kieran exhaled slowly. He had been thinking the same thing. The Ghost had barely evaded the Council ships in the past, yet these things had appeared and disappeared at will. Their weapons, if they could even be called that, weren't designed for destruction. They consumed, folding matter inward like collapsing stars. And yet, when they had the opportunity to do the same to the Ghost, they hadn't. Varen's voice cut through the tension. I don't care why they let us go. I care where we go next. He leaned over the navigation terminal. We need answers, fast. If these things are tearing apart Council fleets, they're either our biggest advantage or the end of all of us. The weight of his words settled over the room. No one argued. Kieran rubbed his temple. Their lead on the Council was gone. The rebellion had no idea what it was dealing with. And somewhere, in the vastness of space, those ships still drifted, waiting, watching. Joran straightened. We can't report back empty-handed. We won't, Kieran said. He turned to Talia. What do we have on Council transmissions? Any sign they know what happened to their fleet? She pulled up the intercepted messages. They're scrambling. Most of their outer systems have gone dark. Silent stations, missing patrols. Whatever hit the Varro's fleet didn't stop there. She hesitated. And there's another thing. Kieran raised an eyebrow. Talia tapped a command, and a fragmented message played over the speakers. It was distorted, but enough words were clear to send ice through Kieran's veins. Containment breached. They, not of this galaxy. Cannot be. The message ended in static. Varen sat back hard in his chair. Containment. Joran shook his head. What the hell were they trying to contain? No one had an answer. Kieran stood. Get me a list of all Council black sites. Hidden research stations. Anything that could be tied to this. Talia frowned. You think this was their fault? I think, Kieran said carefully, that the Council found something they shouldn't have. And now it's loose. The ship was quiet as the crew processed the weight of his words. Varen was the first to break the silence. If the Council was hiding this, they won't let the truth get out. They'll cover it up, even if it means wiping out entire sectors. Joran nodded grimly. We need to find proof before they do. Talia pulled up a star chart, highlighting known Council research stations. Most of these are too public. If they were experimenting on something dangerous, it would be somewhere remote. Kieran studied the map. Then he saw it. A single unmarked system. No trade routes. No colonized worlds. Just a name buried deep in old military records. Gideon's Wake. He tapped the screen. There. That's where we go next. Talia hesitated. There's nothing there. Joran smirked. That's how you know it's important. Kieran turned to the helmsman. Set course. Full burn. As the ghost changed direction, Kieran stared out into the void, his thoughts dark. They weren't just fighting the Council anymore. They were racing against something much worse. The moment the ghost crossed into Gideon's Wake, Kieran felt it. Space wasn't just empty here. It was wrong. The ship systems flickered, momentarily struggling to reconcile the starfield around them, as if the universe itself hesitated to acknowledge this place. The stars seemed stretched, their light distorted by unseen forces, bending in ways that defied logic. Shadows clung unnaturally to the void, deeper than they should have been, as though something unseen lurked between the folds of reality itself. Kieran sat forward in his chair, fingers tightening around the armrests. Talia, run a full-spectrum scan. I want everything. Talia's hands danced over the console, her brow furrowing. Scanners are unstable. Magnetic fields are fluctuating, and, wait. She adjusted a dial. It's like, she hesitated, like the system itself is absorbing our scans. Joran scoffed, arms crossed. That's not how space works. Talia gave him a sharp look. Tell that to whatever's out there. The bridge remained silent as she worked, filtering through the interference. A minute passed before she exhaled sharply. Found something. And you're not gonna like it. The main display flickered, forming a grainy outline of a massive structure. A station, ancient and scarred, half buried in the husk of a dead asteroid. Its metal frame was fused with jagged rock, twisted together like the remnants of some grotesque experiment. The bridge crew watched in eerie silence. Varen's voice crackled over the comms from engineering. That's a whole lot of ugly. Tell me we're not going in there. Kieran stared at the structure, unease curling in his stomach. The Council had erased all records of this place for a reason. Yet here it was, floating at the edge of the known galaxy, abandoned but not empty. Talia zoomed in, enhancing the visuals. The station wasn't just old, it had been breached. Entire sections of the hull were warped, twisted inward as if something had forced its way inside. Deep scars lined its surface, claw marks too precise to be debris damage. Some parts of the metal weren't corroded, they were melted, warped in unnatural formations. Joran exhaled slowly. That doesn't look like battle damage. Varen's voice came through again, lower this time. Still reading 0 power signatures. No atmosphere. No life signs. A beat of silence. I don't trust it. Neither did Kieran. Talia's jaw tightened. If there's no power, how is it still intact? Why hasn't it drifted into a gravity well or been torn apart by micro-impacts? Kieran didn't answer. He knew only one thing. They needed to see it for themselves. The boarding pod detached with a shudder, its thrusters guiding them toward the station's docking ring. The closer they came, the worse it got. The hull was wrong, not just damaged, but altered, as though something had rewritten the station's very structure. The moment the pod latched onto the airlock, a deep groan reverberated through the hull. Joran muttered, "That better be the ship settling and not something waking up." They cycled the airlock manually. The door opened with a reluctant hiss, revealing absolute darkness beyond. Their helmet lights cut through the void, illuminating twisted corridors, walls warped by forces unknown. The air was deathly still. They stepped inside. The silence was unbearable, pressing in from all sides. Their boots echoed too loudly against the metal floor. It felt like walking through a tomb, but there were no bodies, no skeletons, no signs of who had once lived or died here. Talia ran a scanner along the walls. Still no radiation, no biological traces, no residual heat. Joran's grip on his rifle tightened. It's like nothing ever lived here at all. They moved deeper into the station, past shattered bulkheads and collapsed corridors. The deeper they went, the more warped the architecture became. Hallways twisted in angles that defied reason. Doorways led to places they shouldn't. Some rooms had no exits at all, as if the station had rewritten itself over time. Then they found the containment chamber. Kieran's pulse quickened. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, large enough to hold human-sized occupants. Every single one was broken. The reinforced glass lay shattered across the floor, thick metal restraints twisted apart like brittle paper. Something had been here, and it had left. Talia crouched beside a pod, running her scanner along the remains. These weren't normal cryopods. They were reinforced, almost like... She stopped, staring at the readings. Joran peered over her shoulder. "What?" Talia swallowed. "The metal is... regenerating." Kieran's stomach clenched. Joran's voice was quiet. What the hell were they keeping in here? Then, the sound came. Low. Wrong. Not mechanical. Not human. Something alive. The temperature in the room dropped. Frost spread across the walls, creeping like veins, forming delicate, unnatural patterns. Their helmet visors fogged from the sudden shift, and their breath became visible in the dim light. Joran lifted his rifle, eyes scanning the darkness. "We are not alone." A static crackle hissed through their comms. Then, the lights flickered. Kieran turned, just in time to see something move. Not fast. Not a blur. Just a shift in the shadows, a figure standing where there had been nothing a moment ago. Oh! Unnatural. For a single, excruciating second, it didn't move. Then, the lights cut out. The darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, Kieran heard nothing but the sound of his own breath inside his helmet. His pulse slammed in his ears, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then, movement. A slow, deliberate shift in the blackness, like something adjusting to their presence. He couldn't see it, not really, but he felt it. "Lights now," he ordered, voice low. Talia's visor flickered as she activated her backup lamp, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom. The rest followed, thin cones of white light slicing into the station's suffocating void. The corridor ahead was empty. Except they all knew it wasn't. Joran's voice was taut. That thing was right there. Kieran's fingers hovered over his rifle's trigger. It still is. A faint hum crackled through their comms. Distorted, uneven. Not static. Something else. Then the whispering began. It wasn't in any language Kieran recognized. It wasn't even a language. Just a series of layered sounds, something half-formed and incomprehensible, brushing against his mind like fingers trailing over glass. Talia exhaled sharply. "Tell me you're all hearing that." Varen's voice came through the comms, tight with controlled panic. "Not just hearing it. It's in my head." Kieran forced himself to focus. They couldn't fall apart now. "Keep moving. Stay sharp." They pressed forward through the corridor, boots heavy against the steel floor. The frost on the walls had thickened, forming intricate veins of ice that pulsed faintly, as if something alive ran beneath them. Shadows stretched in unnatural directions, resisting the light instead of bending beneath it. They passed more shattered stasis pods, glass crunching underfoot. Then the first body, or what was left of one. Joran crouched beside it, turning it over carefully with the barrel of his rifle. The figure was human, once. A council scientist, judging by the tattered insignia on what remained of their suit. But their flesh had changed. It was stretched, warped in unnatural patterns, as if it had been pulled apart and reassembled by something that didn't quite understand how humans were supposed to look. Talia turned away, jaw clenched. What the hell did they do here? Kieran stared at the body, his stomach twisting. They didn't just keep something locked away. He gestured to the deep claw marks along the walls, the melted bulkheads, the way the metal seemed to have grown into new shapes. They were trying to control it. Joran exhaled. Looks like they failed. The whispering grew louder. Kieran spun, weapon raised. The darkness shifted again, and this time, he saw something. Not a body. Not a shadow. An absence. The shape was humanoid, but wrong. Its form blurred at the edges, as though it wasn't fully in this reality. It stood completely still, yet he felt its attention pressing against him like a physical weight. Talia moved beside him, her breath sharp. We should go. The figure twitched. Not stepped. Not moved. Just shifted. Joran fired. The shot hit nothing. The figure was gone. But something else had changed. The ice on the walls cracked. The whispering stopped. Then the station came alive. The metal around them groaned, bulkheads twisting, doors slamming shut. The corridor behind them folded inward as if the station itself were trying to swallow them. The emergency lights flared, a sickly red glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. Talia shouted, "Run!" They didn't need to be told twice. Kieran led the way, boots pounding against the floor as the walls warped around them. Something crashed behind them, loud, violent, the sound of pursuit. They reached a junction, metal screeching as the passage to their left sealed itself off like a closing wound. "Right!" Kieran shouted. They veered down the open corridor, the air growing thick around them, suffocating. The weight in Kieran's skull increased, pressing against his thoughts like something trying to push its way in. The station wasn't abandoned. It was awake. They reached the docking bay, the boarding pod still attached. Relief flooded through Kieran, until the lights above flickered. The shadow stood between them and the exit. No more shifting. No more vanishing. It was there. Talia's breath hitched. Oh hell! The thing stepped forward. The metal beneath its feet rippled, reality distorting around it like waves on a still lake. Kieran tightened his grip on his rifle, every instinct screaming at him that shooting would be useless. The whispering returned. No longer distant. It was inside his head. You are not meant to be here. The voice was not one. It was many. Layered. Ancient. Kieran gritted his teeth. Yeah. Well, neither were you. Joran fired first. This time, the bullets hit. The figure staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it reacted, its body distorting, like reality itself was struggling to contain it. Then it lunged. Kieran barely had time to move. He fired instinctively, the shots ripping through the air as the thing collapsed into itself, reforming inches away from him. A cold unlike anything he had ever felt swept through his body, numbing his limbs. Talia grabbed him, yanking him backward. Move! Varen's voice screamed through the comms. The pod's powering up. Get in now! They sprinted the last few steps. Joran reached the hatch first, slamming his fist against the control panel. The door hissed open. Talia shoved Kieran inside, following close behind. The whispering rose to a deafening crescendo. Kieran turned, just as the figure reached the threshold. Its face, if it had one, was almost human. Almost. You opened the door. The hatch slammed shut. The pod detached, engines firing, the force throwing them back as they blasted away from the station. Kieran collapsed into his seat, breath ragged. The comms crackled as Varen's voice came through. What the hell just happened? Joran let out a sharp laugh, half hysteria, half disbelief. We met the neighbors. Kieran didn't laugh. His eyes remained locked on the viewport as the station grew smaller in the distance. The red emergency light still pulsed, beating like a slow, patient heart. Not abandoned. Not empty. Waiting. Then, as they drifted further into the void, Gideon's wake disappeared. 1 second it was there. The next, nothing. Just empty space. A silence fell over the crew, heavy and unbreakable. Talia was the first to speak. Her voice was hoarse. "Please tell me we recorded that." Varen's voice came through the comms, shaken but steady. "Every second." Kieran exhaled. That was something, at least. They hadn't stopped whatever was down there. But now, at least, they knew the truth. The Council's real secret wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an experiment. It was something else entirely. Something older. Something waiting. And now it knew them.